Good evening and welcome. Thank you for coming out on this cold night. My name is Tooze. I'm the director of the European Institute and teach in the history department here. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this book launch event for Securing Europe After Napoleon, 1815 and the New European Security Culture, which is published this spring by Cambridge University Press. It's a wonderful, fascinating collection of essays which analyses the legacy of the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the great foundational event, many people I think would say, of European international relations in the 19th century. It discusses how the Congress negotiators opened the way to a new European security culture through the establishment of ambassadorial conferences, transnational police networks, and international commissions that help produce stability in Europe. It strikes me as an exemplary collaboration between historians and social scientists, international relations experts. I'm truly looking forward to the discussion. In fact, I can't tell you what a relief it is to be introducing a panel this evening which isn't about 2015 or 1915, but about 1815. It's a real broadening of the normal, historical and chronological range of events that we've been running recently. It's a real delight. I should also say that I'm extremely curious about the title image of the book. I tend normally to think of the Congress of Vienna as a more territorial and landlocked arrangement. Maybe this is a specifically Dutch perspective on the Congress of Vienna. In any case, I look forward to having this elucidated. And who better to do that than the three editors of the volume in question? It's really a very privileged not just to have one of the people responsible, but all three of us tonight. Leading off the discussion will be Beatrice de Graaf, who's Professor of History and International Relations and Global Governance at Utrecht University. Her research focuses on the history of national security in the West, counter-terrorism and political violence. She leads a project funded by the European Research Council on security history in Europe and beyond, and I believe we have some of the members of that project with us here this evening. Welcome. Beatrice is a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Haan, particularly pleased to welcome this evening, because he is the Professor of Political History at Utrecht University and he's also the Queen Wilhelmina Visiting Professor of the History, Language and Literature of the Dutch-speaking peoples at Columbia, and this is precisely the kind of event, I think, which demonstrates the value of that generous benefaction to Columbia, being able to bring together this kind of panel here. His fields of interest are the political history of democracy and the welfare state in Western Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, the history and memory of the Holocaust and other large-scale violence, as well as regime changes and political transitions since the early modern period. And third in our group is my colleague in German history, Brian Vick, Professor of History at Emory University. His research focuses on modern Germany and Central Europe in the long 19th century and on modern political and intellectual history. And if you want to further deepen your understanding of the Congress of Vienna after tonight's discussion, beyond the edited collection that we're featuring tonight, I would strongly recommend to you his book, The Congress of Vienna, Power and Politics After Napoleon, published by Harvard University Press in 2014, which won the Hans Rosenberg Book Prize for the Central European History Society at the American Historical Association. For years, 4 years ago, we had the pleasure of welcoming Beatrice de Graaf and Brian Vick at a conference on the Congress of Vienna, organised by Victoria de Grazia, my predecessor at the helm of the European Institute, and it's really wonderful to have the three co-editors back here for this panel with Haan, who's been hosted by the Institute of the Department of History this semester. I would like to thank, as usual, our co-sponsors. None of this kind of stuff happens on Columbia campus without a team coming together to make it happen. I'm privileged to be involved with the European Institute, but we're working tonight with the Studies of the Dutch-Speaking World, co-chaired by my colleagues Martha Howell and Pamela Smith, the Maison Française, as ever, our generous hosts in the Maison Bulle, and the Department of History. And we're recording this panel on video, courtesy of my colleague at the back here. Beatrice will start with a presentation of the research project, which led to the book, and then Brian and Ido will make their comments. Before I give the floor to Beatrice, please join me in welcoming our panelists this evening.
Thank you so much, Professor Tooze. Adam, thank you for coming here. It's a delight to explain the history of Europe and Vienna in such here in New York, which is still the heart of international relations, which was Vienna or Amsterdam or the Netherlands so many centuries ago. So what is needed to create a secure peace, or better put, to secure a peace that you just had won in a war? So next to violence, next to military leverage and playing force, diplomacy can help save the day. Not just to prevent wars, but also to end wars and to transition towards a new secure peace. And this week we'll see another example of such a high-stakes summit. I'm very sorry, David. I brought in a picture because I thought people would need it. CNN asked David Reynolds, a colleague of mine, who's Cambridge Professor of International Relations and a specialist in summits, whether this summit, which is now taking place, would be an opportunity for peace or just another high-stakes ego trip. Reynolds' answer was clear and sober. Yes, he said, a summit works, but only if you do not consider it a drama. And you do not consider it a stage, which is, of course, exactly what it is nowadays. But he says summits take stomach. No serious security threat is resolved without only one summit, a few secret talks and a barrage of tweets over 24 hours. Summitry is not about that. It's about learning about and to know the other, trying to understand the other's preoccupations, learn about your opponent's interests, their threats, their fears. That is why leaders want to meet at the summit, to fathom the other, in Reynolds' words. In those close personal encounters, the best leaders were the ones able to employ their personal skills, overcome jet lags, information overload, all kinds of digestive problems, of which Reynolds has written a lot, just to forge a kind of common understanding that someone considered before an enemy or an opponent. So, in our volume, we trace the origins of summits like this. Summits like those that are taking place today, they started about 200 years ago, a little bit more. These were the origins of foreign talk, the beginning of summits, not the summits where royals were involved, the huge stages with palaces and the balls involved. So actually, not quite Vienna in 1850, but perhaps more Paris in November 1850. Because there the frenzy and the fuzzy was avoided and leaders could relate to each other in more sober, level-headed ways. And that brings me to my primary objective. Our primary objective of my research project, but also of this book with the other editors, to analyze and explain the development of the how of the European state system. Lots have been written about Vienna, about the state system, about those high-level summits, but how did it actually emerge? Why did they do it, and especially how? And we conceptualized the how with the term a security culture. Security culture that emerged and was consolidated between 1850 and 1914. And this stood at the basis of this book and our project. And by this we mean, we don't take an absolutist definition of what security is. We see it as a floating, an effervescent concept, and it entails the sum of mutually shared, often conflicting perceptions of interests. What do you want to defend? Threats, what are you afraid of? And the institutions and the practices that you will discuss together to counter these threats. These themes are addressed in our volume by numerous prominent scholars, as well as a new generation of researchers in the field, as they trace the emergence of a new European security culture after Napoleon, after the fall of Napoleon. In doing so, we offer three main contributions to the scholarship of the Congress of Vienna and its consequences. First of all, the essays sketch out a new and more detailed understanding of the nature of Vienna and its aftermath, because people tend to forget that in 1815 it only started, and it only really commenced when Napoleon came back with 100 days. They were already gone, all the leaders of Europe. In February 1815 they'd come home, and only because Napoleon came back, they had to come back again to Vienna and to Paris, and at that point they decided we need to stay here. We need to keep the day, we need to keep our presence here in peacetime, not just conclude a peace, sign a treaty and run back, but stay here and occupy France, for example. So this is the first contribution. The second contribution is that we focus not just on the royals, the sovereigns, the princes, but on the real ones who brought about and maintained these institutions and practices, as well as their motives and ideas. We We illuminate their concept, their images, their narratives through diaries, etc. What we also do in highlighting, for example, people like John Stokes, who was the one who came up with the idea of forming a committee on the Danube. Before that, there were already engineers forming a committee on the Rhine. Rehel Varnhagen, who was a pivotal figure in creating a network of international banks, because, as always, peace has to be paid for. And a third, also a very interesting figure, Kraaienhof, the Dutch engineer who developed a whole system, a mutual assured destruction system of fortresses ranging from Ostende at the North Sea via Ath, Dendermonde, Avinam to Mainz in Germany, and then even further south to the Mediterranean. So this Wellington barrier, it was called. It was the defense system that remained in place after the Allies went home. So these are some, I think, important contributions that we make. What we also do, we contribute to unpacking, deconstructing terms and concepts that we use all the time, like security, like balance of power, like the state system. What exactly do people mean by that? What kind of feelings, what kind of sentiments did they employ? Balancing, as Henry Kissinger later here in the United States used it for his PhD, for his book. He called it a system of realist power bickering and counting, for example, of rockets and missiles. But back then, balancing was the concept which was juxtaposed against the extremism of French terror. So you had the terror, you had the sentiments, you had the radicals, the big ideas, the emotions, and on the other hand, you had the plain, the level-headed, the sober diplomats who were balancing and searching for the juste milieu, a moderation. So they were not conservatives. It was not just a restorative moment. It was also a system of gradually integrating reforms through balancing, through weighing the scales, and designing a new system. And this is what we call historicizing security. So what kind of assumptions, what kind of sentiments came into play? This is what we also do with our volume. As you can see here, collective security was already very much a theme in 1850. There's Napoleon coming back trampling on the plan for the security of Europe while they're cutting up the cake of Europe. So this is how the plan for security of Europe really was born, and what did that plan entail? Well, all kinds of things, and this is what our volume addresses. I would be very happy to say more about this, but I can't very much advertise you to buy the book because it's over $100. I'm very sorry for that. But I hope that you can encourage your librarian to buy it, and then you can browse it. And you will find out that we focus more on the how the security worked, we focus on second-tier officials and agents, and on the social learning mechanisms, because they remained in place. They stayed during peace in Europe. First of all, during the occupation of France, but many more committees were erected. The first committees, the first conferences ever. Before that, from 1648 until 1850, only a handful, 6 or 7 huge congresses were being organized. After that, after 1850, dozens of congresses and conferences took place, and they left out the kings and queens and all those altogether. Because you cannot do much good with a king taking the stage. You need the real diplomats and experts. And that, here's the Allies in Paris, where they made the decisions. These are the minutes, the protocols of the Allied Council, a NATO Security Council that was founded in 1850 that lasted until 1819, where they met on a daily basis, deliberating how the terror should be moderated, how new fortresses should be built, and it's all there in the archives. And the volume is the first expression of this. More conferences followed suit. So coming to an end, the thing is, these instances of transnational exchanges, these social learning processes, people do not just go to a summit and sit together if there's no need for it, if they don't feel the urge. And that's why I made this picture. The overarching urge, the looming threat which forged all these diplomats, those experts together, was of course the wide-headed monster of terror and revolution, despotism by Napoleon, and also the terror of the revolution. And it was considered as a continuum. It started with revolutionary activism, beheadings, the terror regime, and it would inevitably end in Napoleon as a despot, as a hegemon, taking over the whole of Europe. And that could never happen again. That's why all the other states of Europe stood up in Napoleon, only in 1850, not before the Second Coalition. And they said, well, we now need to stick together, we need to come up with all kinds of conferences and ideas and keep those forums intact, before otherwise another hegemon will stand up and rise again and conquer us, be it Alexander I, of whom they were very afraid, or perhaps the Prussians, or perhaps even the Austrian Empire again. So this is how they try to contain it. And that brings me to the end of my question. The question is symmetry, how it was invented in the 19th century, is that still the art of forum talk and symmetry that we have today? Should we ask whether symmetry is still considered a valuable tactic? We have seen how state leaders are undermining the summits. They are not inviting their experts and the professional agents with them. They're just hooking up with another state leader alone, and even compelling the interpreters not to or hand over their notes. So we do not know what has been discussed there at all. We have seen Trump and Kim use Twitter to message one another. So the answer is, are today's summits still the legacy of the summits, how they were invented in 1850? I think the answer, the response to that is more worrying. What we saw after 1815 was how, I told you, the overarching common enemy forged countries together, aligned fears and threat perceptions, and hence merged and institutionalized their collective security approaches. Today's age, however, sees the drama turning inwards. State leaders nowadays, they do not cater to the international system of diplomats and elites, they cater to the domestic audience, which was, of course, totally absent in 1850. Their domestic audience, and they turn their and their opinions can change per tweet. So the enemies are no longer common, depending on the news outlets. Threat perceptions are shattered and quite radical, both at the same time. In that sense, I'd say that our book is also a monument to how it was all conceived back then as undramatic, sober-faced diplomacy, cooperation for common sense balance of power politics, embedded within a culture of moderate enlightenment and solid conservatism. Thank you very much.
Okay, first let me say how very happy I am and surprised also maybe a bit that this is an enormous audience for a topic that is definitely of historical interest and as Beatrice has demonstrated, of course also of contemporary interest. But still, it's 1815 and a book that is horribly expensive. Actually, not as expensive as Beatrice mentioned, because Cambridge University Press was so kind to give a discount.
Oh,
so
thank
if
you.
you want to buy a book for a price at a discount of no less than 20%, you will take a leaflet,
$80.
punch in the code, and
You
have
need
a
the opportunity.
great book. So it's less than $10 per article in the book. So it's a bargain. So what I want to emphasize is the historical contribution that we make also to the terrain of restoration history. That many people traditionally have thought of restoration as a sort of intermission between the interesting parts of history and between the French Revolution and the Revolution of 1830 and 1848, and seeing the restoration as a sort of dull period where only conservatism and reactionary thoughts dominated, but actually in the more recent historiography that we also try to tie into in our book, the period from 1815 till the 1830s is actually a period of political experimentation, of tremendous tensions, of opposition, not just opposition of various ideological parts, so liberals, early socialists, but also more violent Bonapartists, former soldiers of Napoleon, and actually also of Napoleon himself. It is deep into the 1820s, after Napoleon has not just been banned but also died, that he was supposedly seen with armies of all kinds of different people roaming around Europe. That was an idea that was stimulated also by the fact that there were a whole series of revolts in all parts of Europe, in Spain, in Italy, in France, in the various parts of Germany, maybe not that violent, but there was all the time the threat. You had Greece, you had Russia. So all over Europe there were violent uprisings, confrontations with a lot of people fighting and dying in the struggle. So there was a widespread fear, if that works like this, that there was a threat to the existence of every throne in Europe that had been established at the time. And so we have here the picture of 1825, the Decembrist uprising in Russia. Now, there is a discussion recently, and the book by Zamoyski has been another contribution to that debate, that the idea of revolutionary uprisings and the possibility that there was another revolution was mainly imaginary, that this was a fear that was not actually real, but a fabulation of informants who wanted to earn some money by telling the most ludicrous stories about all these revolutionaries. Now, it is clear in the first place that there were all kinds of violent revolts, but the question actually was maybe more to what extent this was coordinated, to what extent there was actually an international revolutionary conspiracy going on, or as one of the revolutionaries called it and aimed to create that picture, a Sainte Alliance des Peuples, or a holy alliance of the people, in contrast to the other holy alliance, or as it was often also called, there was certainly a comité directeur in Paris, a leading committee that was actually organizing all this. Now, it will be impossible to determine to what extent that was actually the case, and actually the question for us was not that interesting whether that was the case. The more interesting question that we had to ask is, how did people try to get information and to put fragmentary pieces of information together in order to establish to what extent that was the case or not, and how that contributed to what we call a European security culture. So what some of the contributors in this book tries to establish is how, especially police services, try to work together in order to get a grip on that suspicion, on something that might not be the case, but many people thought or feared would be the case. And on the basis of research in archives all over Europe, in Rome, in Paris, in Brussels, and German sources that we used, we came up with an image in which we tried to get a grip on the question to what extent, to how people understood there was maybe a coordinated action. And that fear is expressed by information that police services gathered. This is just one example of drawings of a dagger that was presented to the Paris police in 1824. A dagger supposedly celebrating Louvel, the murderer of the Duc de Berry, and threatening all the other royals in Europe as an indication of that there was such a threat. Now, the way in which that worked was through a series of, you might say, epistemological operations. First of which was drawing up lists of people who were supposedly suspicious, who in some way or another stood out, who were seen by someone. So there's record keeping of people, also blacklisting people. If you have a name, you can refuse people, but also making lists as the basis of further investigations, trying to establish not just a list of people, but also creating, you might say, guilt by association, by creating an image of the networks that people were involved in. And so part of the study that we made was on interrogations, police interrogations, and what you see in those police interrogations is that police services mainly ask about the other people that people know. So they hardly ask about your ideas or your plans, but who do you know? And so trying to create an image of what the network is actually about. A third element then, next to lists and networks, is then monitoring mobility. So where do people move? Which was very hard to establish because at the time there were not actual passports. This was the first moment passports were developed. Mainly passports that said, because of course had no photography, said, well, this is a man of average height, brown hair and dark eyes. And that was, of course, not very helpful. There were ways to make that a bit more helpful, but in the end, very, very difficult. Innkeepers had a substantial role in tracking people. So records of innkeepers were followed, but still, it was difficult, but not impossible. And one example we have here, this is Louvel, murder of the Duc de Berry, and when he was arrested immediately after the killing, they were able to track his path through Europe before he had ended up killing the Duc de Berry. So it was possible to at least follow some of these tracks.
When was this murder?
1822.
1822. Yeah.
Duc de Berry.
And
Royal Patent.
then a fourth operation is comparing. And that is something that you see on the right-hand picture. So this is an account of two main societies, the Société des Saint-Maîtres Parfaits and the Société Teutonique. So a French and a German secret society listed together, this goes on endless pages and pages, of the ways in which these are organized, their aims, their programs, comparing and establishing the fact that actually they look very much the same, and by trying to get that argument going, if they look the same, they must be coordinated in some way or another. This is a very characteristic of many of the police reports. So they really list those things, put them next together and try to compare. And then finally, what they do is decoding communication. And actually decoding in a very literal way as secret codes that are used, all adding, of course, to the suspicion that actually something is going on. It's very, very secret. Look at that, they use secret codes. Now, all of this did not lead to any certainty about the extent to which there was an international conspiracy going on. But it did lead to consultation, not of the revolutionaries, but of the police services. So what you see is actually the connections that these police services make in the way in which they operate. So you see all over Europe, first of all, an enormous growth in this period of police services. And of course, many people have argued that this is a history that starts before, it starts, the main impetus it gets from the Napoleonic period, and that is true, but I would say in quantitative terms, and especially in qualitative terms, the police services have an enormous growth and development after 1815. Ironically, this is less so maybe in France, and one reason might be that the French regime was very unstable, highly contested, so that all kinds of different sections within the regimes developed their own police services that did not work together very well. More coordinated and more effective, you might also say, was in the much less homogeneous German lands, where you did have coordinated police services. And there's an interesting contribution of Karl Herter in the volume that we present today, in which he explains that perhaps this collaboration in the German lands is a sort of prefiguration of police collaboration in the larger Europe. So you have in 1819 the Centrale Untersuchungskommission in Mainz, and then 1833 the Zentraluntersuchungsbehörde in Frankfurt. So central committees that actually coordinate police investigations, not just in the German lands proper, but also elsewhere. There's a lot of contact with Italy, but also with Russia, with France, Spain, all kinds of contexts that were there. Also, the model in which those research groups worked in terms of research commissions, so sort of improvised temporary structure, not very deeply institutionalized, but still there and deeply focused on doing research was a very important element. What did these new institutions, police organizations do? First of all, of course, collecting information, of course, in the way in which I just explained, by using newspapers. That was the first source of information. So the first thing that the Commission in Mainz did, it took subscriptions on all European newspapers that were available at the time, and they really scanned all those newspapers trying to find out all these things that I tell you. And of course, they relied on informants. Very problematic, because Samoyski was right. Informants sometimes told stories that were actually not true. So you had to distinguish the fake news from the real news. There's nothing new there, I would say. And then they found that information, and then what they did, they shared that information. So one very important element is sharing information by communicating with people elsewhere. So this note that I just saw you of the code was something that was found in Spain, actually, on a former soldier of the army of Napoleon who had fled to Catalonia, was arrested there, and they found this note on his body, in his pocket, and that was sent to Paris. The other information about the societies was based on information found in Italy, also sent. Very important report on the revolutionaries in France was sent to Russia, because that was might be relevant there. So they shared information, communication networks that then were created. And one important aspect here is, by creating such a network, this European security culture as it emerged also allowed for smaller states and also non-state actors to become involved in that larger framework. Now, this is a clear example of the way in which this security culture consultation was created, but it also meant that there was a lot more international interaction. So it also led, and that is my final point, it also led to international tensions, because once you were allowed and able to get a grip and to understand what was going on elsewhere, you also wanted to have some actions taken there. And so one example that we present in the book is tensions rising in Brussels because of information of a Masonic lodge, several Masonic lodges actually, that were active there, of which very prominent people from the Netherlands were active. And I have here the two sons of King William, Frederick and Crown Prince William, who both were active in Masonic lodges. Actually, the younger son was the head of the Masonic lodge for the Low Countries. William was active in the Masonic lodge d'Espérance. And it was in that context that he then met people who suggested to him that he might want to replace Louis XVIII, the King of France. So there would be an uprising in France, a new king would be put there, and the question was Crown Prince William not prepared to take that position? And actually he was not against it. He had all kinds of difficulties with his father. He really wanted to have some adventure also. He's a very adventurous guy. He had been active in Spain in the army of Wellington. So he was in for some adventurous stuff. Of course, all this came out, and not just that he had this awful plan to subvert the French monarchy, but also that he might be behind a murder attack on Wellington himself. And that really annoyed the British. It annoyed Wellington, who demanded his former officer to come, and he actually said to him, that he will not concede that this has brought your name into discussion in a very disagreeable way to your friends. A very British way to express his disagreement. Even more painful, the Crown Prince William was then interrogated by the French minister Paquier, and of course during the interview he denied. He said, "I'm innocent like everyone before the law. I cannot be subjected to intervention by a foreign minister." The whole issue is that once you created the European security culture, you could be subjected to intervention by a foreign minister, and it did create international tensions that then had to be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation and setting the opportunity to talk about the new book. And also for all of the attendant organizing, particularly for François and the staffs at the European Institute and the Maison Française. So I tend to identify myself in part as a practitioner of the new culturally inflected international history, or new diplomatic history, as well as an intellectual cultural historian. In my work in and around the Congress of Vienna, I took a wider view of power and of diplomacy based on broader conceptions of power and of politics. Rather than only thinking in terms of power politics in the sense of the realist school of international relations theory, we should also analyze diplomacy and international relations in terms of what I call influence politics. Power politics, influence politics. We can still speak of power politics as long as we keep in mind a more complex and nuanced conception of what that entails, of what power is. I thus also emphasize the role of salon culture, festive culture, court culture, governmental institutions, the press, and various publics as part of the praxis of European politics, and hence including a wider range of actors, and including women as well as men. Such an analytical shift incorporates the persuasive force of written and spoken words, of ideas, of symbols, rituals, and social practice, all as elements that already fed into what actors then thought of as public opinion and referred to as public opinion. Politically engaged women and men could try to persuade wider publics or the narrower publics of salon society and capital city societies, or they could directly try to lobby rulers or officials or advisors. In terms of the present collection, while one can practice the new international history without the invoking the securitization concept, I do think that it can be particularly useful and insightful for a couple of reasons. For one, thinking in terms of security cultures points to different frameworks and mindsets and distinct goals for the decision makers and those trying to influence them. It lets us take a novel and narrower slice through the field of diplomacy and international relations that can reveal new facets to otherwise well-studied phenomena. At the same time, analyzing international relations in terms of security cultures puts the spotlight on still other groups of interests and actors that might be revealed in traditional diplomatic history or new notions of influence politics. For example, new groups of agents involved in enforcement or surveillance rather than in policymaking itself, and new groups of people trying to influence them or to profit from their activities. This is particularly evident in the area of policing and political police in individual countries and across borders, as Eno's remarks have highlighted. In a related vein, the security culture's approach can do much to eliminate the connections between foreign and domestic policy, and between individual sovereign states and international relations, not just in the 20th century, but also in the 19th, though perhaps I should put that the other way and indicate the potential for security studies of the 19th century to shed light on later developments in the 20th century or later, particularly as these periods operated with tools and institutions whose roots can be traced back to the 19th century more often than one might think. So at the level of institutions, which is the focus of part 2 of the book, I would emphasize the role of new multilateral venues for negotiation, for exchanges of information, and for enforcement of decisions that had already been made. These venues often function in the spaces between traditional bilateral diplomacy, from court to court on the one hand, and the important but less frequent occasions of these Congress summit meetings of rulers and leading statesmen. And here, I above all highlight the role of ambassadorial conferences as an important innovation in diplomacy, in part for crisis management, but also for crisis prevention. Through the 19th century and beyond, the ambassadorial conferences that emerged from the peace negotiations of 1815 did as much as the more famous congresses to shape the Vienna system of international relations. Institutionally, the ambassadorial conferences point to the origins of international agencies and of specialized multilateral commissions to tackle pressing international issues. They also extended the role of face-to-face diplomacy beyond the big summit meetings of leading statesmen and rulers at the congresses, and provided some of the main venues for the influence of what international relations scholar Jennifer Mitzen terms forum talk, in the formation of binding international obligations amongst the great powers. Conversing together with increasingly familiar and trusted peers in at least semi-public forum that carried weight and responsibility, the ambassadors could come more readily to compromise agreements and hopefully even feel committed to the agreements that emerge, to the final decisions that are made. The conferences also promoted cooperation through transparency among the various governments and information sharing. I would also add the fact that the diplomats and their wives, often already, wives or daughters, had already built up some familiarity in the course of socializing in court society or in the capital cities and residences, allowed the conferences to function all the more smoothly. So both Beatrice's chapter and mine in this book deal particularly with this new institution. Beatrice's on the Allied Council overseeing the occupation of France between 1815 and 1818, and then mine on the London ambassadorial conferences in the years after 1815, which was charged to help with the internationalization of abolition of the African slave trade, and with trying to halt the seizures of European ships and citizens by the North African so-called Barbary corsairs. And Adam, it is actually from this angle that you get the cover image with the Mediterranean connection, actually. So partly with my contribution and then also Eric DeLange's. And in this volume, it's focusing on the period after 1815. But actually you could trace discussions of both of these issues, abolition and the corsairs, back to the Congress of Vienna itself. So one of the chapters in my book, I focus on the negotiations involving abolition of the African slave trade and then also the Barbary corsairs. Now, these ambassadorial conferences would go on to be used to help resolve conflicts or to oversee the solutions to crises already in Naples after the Revolution of 1820 and in the Papal States after 1830 and its revolutions, as well as helping to establish the new independent states of Greece and Belgium, also just before and after 1830. Another such conference would then help oversee the execution of the Versailles Treaty and the occupation of Germany after the First World War. And in between, there was a whole raft of conferences on really a wide array of different international issues and topics, in and around some of the more famous wars or conflicts or war scares, but also on many other topics as well. In this section, Schenck's chapter examines one of the most direct links between the Congress of Vienna and later multilateral diplomatic institutions, and indeed one of the closest links between 1815 and our own day, in the case of the Central Commission for Navigation on the Line, which was the first real international intergovernmental organization, which is still in action today. And similar river regimes were established for the Elbe, the Danube, as mentioned, and others in Europe and in other parts of the world as well. And for present purposes, Schenck's study underscores the importance of conceptions of economic security for multilateral international cooperation. Also in this section, Stella Gervas looks at the new security culture and security regime with a focus on Tsar Alexander and the Russians, and thus she reevaluates the role of the Holy Alliance, and stresses the importance of a shift from notions of balance of power to what she terms a balance of negotiation, centered on communication and common goals and values, rather than secrecy and competition. And then in the final chapter of that section, Volksgrüner looks at the German Confederation as itself a multi-state entity that was established to be the real cornerstone of European security by keeping the peace domestically through police institutions, among other things, but not just within Germany and its constituent states, but also to try to keep the peace within Europe as a whole by helping to stabilize Central Europe. That emphasis, I think, is in a way that President James would certainly appreciate. Institutions could also involve the development of transnational policing, as has already discussed. So at the level of agents and actors, which is the focus of part 4, I would emphasize the sheer diversity of actors by function, again, also including women as well as men, and Jews alongside Christians. Glenda Sluka's chapter, for example, brings in the dimension of finance and the role of bankers, but also the role of salonière, as she reveals another perspective on efforts to establish economic security and to use international financial transactions to help undergird the measures to stabilize European society and maintain peace, not least the military foundations of peace. One of my favorite chapters in the book is the one on Friedrich Gentz and the Eastern Question by Konstantin Ardleanu. There we can see the importance of the correspondence between Gentz and the Hospodars of Wallachia under the Ottomans, partly as a two-way conduit for diplomatic intelligence, but also as a vector for the transmission of the new rules and practices and values associated with the new security culture. So moving from Vienna, Gentz's home base, into Eastern Europe in Bucharest. And then finally, in that section, Mark Jarrett's contribution focuses once again on the level of great statesmen, focused on Castlereagh in this case, but considering the formation of their beliefs and attitudes in a broader context. So not exactly just ideologies that might have been influencing decision making, but other kinds of beliefs and memes that were maybe floating through diplomats' minds that shaped the way that they tried to interact with one another, but also to make policy. And then just one final point, which involves one of the larger questions of historical interpretation about 19th century international relations, and is in some ways an unacknowledged paradox. Famously, the Vienna system of international relations in the sense of the Congress framework only lasted from 1814 to 1822, with the final Congress of Verona. The more general Congress system that helped deliver a lasting peace in Europe into the 1850s, or depending on how you read it, even up into the early 1900s, however, did not involve congresses in the sense of these multilateral summit meetings to nearly the same extent. So what was it then about the concert of Europe, as this later phase is often called, that helped keep the peace better than in the era before 1814 or 1790, or potentially after the First World War? Was it just something about the existence of a pentarchy of great powers? And here, I think that incorporating the full range of institutions and actors who made up part of the original Vienna system, too, helps to provide the answer as to what filled that gap between 1822 and 1914. And again, I point above all to the ambassadorial conferences as a flexible means, flexible mechanism of diplomatic exchange and of crisis prevention, as well as of crisis management. But these function as part of a larger conjury of institutions, of ideas, of agents, and of norms and practices, as Matthias Schulz and other of our contributors would put it, and including other forms of monarchical meetings of the sort described so well by Johannes Cullom. Adding the notion of a European security culture to this mix helps explain the longevity and relative stability of the Vienna system all the more fully. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you to all three of you for giving us three different takes on what is obviously a fascinating volume. And maybe for the sake also of our audience, I can pick up where Brian left off and ask you for a more, this is going to be a crude question, and I'm going to just not exactly exploit my privilege as chair, but sacrifice as myself as chair to ask this question, which is where this book leaves us in thinking about the Congress. So Brian, I think, gave us one clear answer at the end. In other words, the Congress is credited with having maintained peace in Europe better than the 18th century order did. One question I would have to you as a group is whether you adhere to the peace through 1914 school, or whether you're more in the kind of Geyer and Bright vision, which would basically see any kind of peaceful order of the 19th century exploding in the 1850s and 60s, and not just in Europe, but worldwide at that point, where, frankly, if you look at death figures worldwide, you see an epidemic of mass killing, of which Europe shows sort of concentrated flickers, but the really big violence is going on somewhere else. So is there a thesis here about violence management and violence displacement, which is thicker as a result of our understanding of this network of interrelationships, which you're sketching out for us in a much more multifaceted way? Is that one of the contributions? The other line that I wanted to go down, and I wanted to occasionally I had to sort of pinch myself listening to you, because the other line that's often taken on Congress of Vienna is, sure, it's a triumph of stability, but it's a triumph of conservatism, darkest repressive conservatism. It's the suppression of everything that we as modern liberals regard, as important to us. Human rights, the rule of law, freedom of speech, and some sense of national identity. Now, are those things related to each other? In other words, are you going down the kind of full conservative hog, a la Gerhard Ritter, who would say, yes, exactly, and that's why peace is maintained? And when the lid comes off, violence break out. In other words, peace in Europe is a conservative cause, which it is after Napoleon. Forgive the crudeness. I want to tell me why this is a crude way and a stupid way of formulating the question, if indeed it is, and how this book changes the terms. Because listening to Ido at various points, I had to remind myself that all these lovely networks of interaction and communication you're talking about are the beastly repressive conservative spies who are locking people up because their thoughts are free, right? And are forcing people to migrate around Europe to escape the repressive Metternician system. You know, this lovely network they have in Germany is the Karlsbad decrees and the spy network that's put in place afterwards. Right? And it is indeed highly effective, but I don't think anyone's ever... I mean, certainly speaking from the radical history, I think we've always thought it was effective. I didn't realise how tightly woven it was, which is fascinating to discover, and, you know, your material's great, but I really did have to... Because the feel of the gestus is... International relations history of the 1920s, the thicker the network, the better, the deeper international society, the more comfortable we feel, and perhaps it does produce peace. But the story you're telling us is of the creation of a deeply conservative network of that kind. Perhaps no longer aristocratic, but all the more bourgeois for that. And in Beatrice's formulation, right at the very beginning, it was almost a sort of affirmative embrace of conservatism. Sensible, down-to-earth, non-revolutionary, balancing. This is just my paraphrase, but nevertheless, that was the kind of gestus. Now, my question was, is this a descriptive position, or almost, again, a normative embrace in light of the peace balancing? Because, to put our 21st century hat on, all of this language, of course, can be then applied to the EU, and we know where that leads, right? It is indeed deep, it is indeed thick of civil society, it does indeed guarantee peace, and it is the heartbreak of every progressive European at this moment, right? So my one way of reading this would be to say that for me of reading this would be this is another one of those European ventures in the creation of a security culture that leads to the kind of disasters which, you know, we've seen in the Eurozone, that we see with regard to migration culture. You know, it makes me feel creeped out. So I said, I mean, at this point maybe I am abusing my position as chair, but I'm also, I'd love to get your response to this provocation, because it was provocative to hear the account of the book.
I guess I can take a first stab at this. Maybe 3 points. And I guess first I would say with the European Union that we don't know where it leads yet. Part of the problem these days is that it's such a moment of uncertainty, which was also like the period that we were talking about. If you step back and think of it as, open-ended, looking at it from the front. And
so there's a historicist kind of...
Yeah, and trying to historicize security is very much part of what we were trying to do. I would also say, and I hope it doesn't make you not want to buy the book, that we think of this very much as an opening of a field, something that we hope will be path-breaking, maybe landmark also, but really opening up a lot of new avenues to examine the international relations and security culture of the 19th century and try to see connections with later periods. And so I think I would speak for all three of us on that. And then the other 2 points, maybe more specifically from my perspective. For one, I definitely want to emphasize that the displacement of violence from Europe to other parts of the world is a phenomenon that already kicks in after 1815. So both I and Eric de Lange, again with his contribution, really try to emphasize that. And it's connected with the cover image. So there, but not only there. That part of the price of keeping the peace in Europe was kind of exporting violence and competition overseas, or even sometimes when it was cooperation that they were exporting, it was for exploitation of other regions. So I'm not denying that after 1860 or so, the scale of the violence both, well, okay, not so much within Europe if you compare it to the Napoleonic period, but outside Europe, definitely does.
Are the
does
contemporaries
grow.
clear about that? Because this sounds like a Schmittian theme, but are the contemporaries actually aware of that displacement effect?
Yes.
Is that something that emerges from the sources? They understand what they're doing in that process?
Can I react to that?
Yeah, I would just say no, but if you want to jump in on this.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, because sorry, you can pick up later. No, this is exactly to the core of my contribution as well. Because what happened is that when the society of orders, feudal society, was abandoned in the 18th century through the French Revolution, it didn't come back to a certain extent. Of course, it wasn't radical enough, abandoned at all, but it was a way, and something else came instead, and that was something that the powers of Europe, the Pentarchy, abroad, but also at home, developed with each other. It started with Alexander and Pitt in 1805, and it was taken up in 1813 and 1815 again, and they invented a new set of standards for worldwide hierarchy. There were first-ranked nations, second-ranked nations, and third-ranked nations. And the first-ranked nations had to stick together, the Pentarchy, first the Quadruple Alliance, and then in 1818 with France.
So the five of France,
So for Prussia,
Russia.
France not at first, but Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Great Britain, and then later on France as well. Second-ranked nations were the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and the smaller German countries. And the third-ranked nations were the Italian countries and the very small German nations, Switzerland, and here comes, interestingly enough, United States into play.
How about the Ottomans?
And the Ottomans, I come to that later. First of all, they entered the United States. John Adams. He tried to find his way into the first rank group of nations. And he complained with Castaway, why am I not invited? I want to be part of the Paris conference, of these ambassadorial conference. We need to be there. You're going to intervene with the pirates, and we are doing that as well. We want to be part of those first-ranked nations. And the Europeans said, no, we do not want you there. That's why he came up with the Monroe Doctrine, for example. No. So this is how Europe invented this very exclusive group, elitist group of nations. However, within the exclusive group of nations, security, peace, order, karma, stability were served out. Outside that group, it meant that everything was free for looting and pillaging. For example, the Ottomans, they were not granted first, second, or third rank status. They were invited as an observer to the Vienna Congress. But when the Ottoman Sultan heard of this ranking, and he found out that he was not ranked at all, he said, then we're not going to come at all. Right. So there was some observer, but not the formal one. So this is how the Europeans did security, and we are not, what I tried to do there was not making a plea for conservatism, but making a plea for understanding how people thought at the time, right. Which is, I think, still very much important. I mean, it's not about how you feel about Europe and the European Union, it's about how the Europeans feel about it. Because they have to vote and they can do things. So before you stand up and reject the whole thing, you need to understand why many Europeans are very happy with what they had. It was the same in 1815. People came from a situation where 5 to 7 million men had died, where the bubonic plague raged again, especially these 3 last years. The populations decreased. The last time that happened in Europe was in the medieval times. So it was a dreadful time. So people were so fed up with wars that policing instead was not as bad as wars. And this is what the countries of Europe, the first-ranked nations, did all the time, putting up the specter of terror and war and hegemony. Do you want that, or do you want a little bit of policing? And not to say that I agree with it, but that's how it worked.
Thank you, that was fantastic. I want to come back on the Ottomans, but Brian had a third point.
Yeah, relating to the question of conservatism. And here, Ido and I may disagree somewhat. I tend more to the spectrum of those who emphasize that the Congress of Vienna was actually not nearly as reactionary as it's cracked up to be. Actually, the years 1814, 1815 saw one of the largest waves of constitution establishments any time in history. And even people like Metternich, who are featuring very prominently in the more radical or liberal historiography of the period, coming out of the 19th century, that had accused it so much of being reactionary, he also was willing to approve of constitutional regimes in many places, precisely because he thought too strong a counter-revolutionary, repressive approach might actually provoke the very revolution that he wanted to try to stop. So certainly he approved of the reintroduction of a constitution in France with the Bourbon Restoration. But I would also emphasize, for example, that with these the ambassadorial conferences that oversaw the restoration of Ferdinand's government in Naples after the revolutions of 1820, it was precisely to try to keep him from being too counter-revolutionary and to try to uphold the amnesty that they had hammered out. So the ambassadors were actually trying to pull him back a little bit more towards the reformist side and towards moderation. And so in general, that's how I tend to read the Congress, certainly in my book, as not being that conservative and having even more tolerance for things like national identity than is often credited. And that is also part of the explanation of its relative success for quite some time. And there I do come down more on the side of those who see significant survivals of the Vienna system after the Crimean War. I don't think that completely
so all the way
gets
through
rid of
to
it.
1914.
And even after the national unifications, much though those were obviously shaped by warfare.
Great.
Just one quick note on the overseas dimension. I do tend to put the date a little later at which non-European powers were increasingly kind of not considered as part of the Comity of Nations. Like with Edward Keene's study of British treaty making relating to abolition. It really seems like it is around the 1840s when new schools of positive law are being formed that really are almost completely Eurocentric. Whereas in 1820s and 1830s, there's still a bit more flexibility on that. Though clearly a power like the Porte, the Ottoman Empire, was not happy with the way things had developed even then.
Thank you, that was really helpful. Edo.
Yeah, so I think your questions are not only justified, but also the hard questions that we might want to have thought about longer maybe than we did at the time when we put the book together. An important thing here, first of all, is to point out is that what we try to show here is that the Congress of Vienna and also the Congress system itself is much more than just the Congress and those meetings. It's a culture.
Yes.
So it is very widespread in the sense that it really transformed the way in which not just leaders, diplomats, but also other people started to think about what actually was required to have a peaceful society. It's from that perspective, of course, even more terrible that this was a very repressive society. And I think I can agree with your estimate that this was in many ways the development of a very repressive state. So I would even argue that this was not a period of diminished violence. If you look at not just at the revolts, but also at the repression and the death penalties and the people who were put into prison or banned and suffered far away. The international actions like bombing Algiers and many other very violent interventions. So this was not a period of less violence, I would say. It was a very violent period, yet within another understanding of what actually a peaceful society was than in the Napoleonic period, because it was also violent, but in a completely different way. Now the the crucial point here is the terms conservative and progressive. And I think, yes, of course, many of the people who played a central role in the Congress of Vienna were very conservative in the sense that they did not want to have a revolution. That revolutionary change was bad. They differed fundamentally on all kinds of more substantial issues about how societies and also the international system was supposed to look like. They had very substantially different understandings of that, much more religiously inspired versus more liberal, much more, you might say, ancien regime kind of notions versus modern constitutionalist. It differed substantially, but they were contributing, I would say, to the image that we now start to develop of this period, of a period of experimentation and innovation. So it is conservative mainly in their ideological outlook in various ways, but it is, you might say, very progressive, experimental, innovative in the way in which they develop all kinds of institutions. And I think it is relevant to keep that in mind, that states and societies can innovate, can change dramatically by conservative means and from the perspective of conservative goals. And we tend to forget that kind of innovative nature of this period. And from that perspective, yes, I would not say that this was the period when a police state was created. A police state is really something different, basically because the lack of instruments to effectively police society. But yes, it all had all kinds of characteristics that we tend to ascribe to states as they develop only much later at the end of the 19th century or maybe even in the 20th century. So that's, I think, the important point, but I think you're right, and it might have been part of my contribution as well. There's a certain joy of finding this material in the archive. Yes, they actually thought that and did that, and it's fascinating. They draw the dagger, yes. So I thought it was fun to work on this, but it's not a fun period.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I've had my go. Let's have some more questions. I'll take two at a time. I'll start over there. I've got Ivan at the back, and then gentleman on the left with the glasses. I'll go back and forth.
So these police networks and increased police action remind me of today's militarization of the police and the police siding with the conservative position, which is something that you see happening a lot more in America than you are seeing in the European Union. And personally, I think one of the reasons for that is America's involvement in the Iraq War. The militarization of the police did not just start as a top-down policy change, it was a change from within the police, more specifically. We now have combat veterans with PTSD in the police force managing the police. So you said that Germany was unique in establishing these police networks. Another unique aspect of Germany at this time was the rise of veterans organizations. And I wondered if in your research you have found any overlap between these two sets of organizations, and perhaps that what caused the police to come together in their kind of neurotic conspiracy theory networks was
PTSD.
Was PTSD and their shared trauma and their shared identity as veterans.
Fantastic. That went in such an interesting direction. Here, a gentleman to the front with glasses.
Yeah, this is specifically for...
if you could tell us who you are when you ask the question. Just
Alex Ramos, Cuny Graaf Center. So I've done a lot of research in the development of bureaucracy, and particularly the French Foreign Ministry, so it's probably mostly for Professor Vick. With this development of increasing kinds of diplomacy, with again intermediary organizations, we talked about the ambassadors meeting together. Is there I assume there's a concomitant expansion of the size of foreign ministries all across Europe, and also professionalization and bureaucratization, which really was limited even under Napoleon, where the French Foreign Service did not have a foreign service exam until, I think, really the early 20th century. So That's why I'd be interested.
Thank you. I had another question at the front here. Yes, gentleman here at the front with the braces, and then we'll wrap those three and go back to the panel.
Thank you, Malcolm Arnold. My question is two-part and they're connected to Mr. Graaf and Mr. Haan. Is that you spoke about the different commissions that were going on at that time, and they had the commission on the anarchists. And so if you could tell us a little bit about that, what they accomplished, what they hope to set out to do in the future, and what they saw as the threat. And the connecting question to Mr. Haan is that you talked about the interconnecting of the security states, I believe, with the smaller states being able to actually play a part in this. Do you see this as a predecessor to Interpol, and do you see that if there are any other predecessors to Interpol within the security apparatuses before that time?
So you can see the presentist interest that this topic apparently inevitably produces.
Yes.
Who would like to take these questions?
Shall I start with
Yes.
the militarization of the police? I'm not sure that is what you actually see at this particular moment in time. My impression is that the issue of the army is really a very different issue in present day as it was then. The problem of army and armies in general was how to reintegrate an enormous amount of young men within a society that had been dislocated and had been across all parts of Europe, had been involved indeed in very heinous violence, and had to find a place again. That was a serious problem about how to deal with that. I don't think that within the police services or forces there was any idea that you should integrate those people within the police force. And the basic reason was that because most of those soldiers, and the most dangerous, the soldiers that were considered the most dangerous, were soldiers that were supporting Napoleon, who had a Bonapartist, revolutionary perspective on society. So that were the last you want to integrate in your police force. I think the issue of militarization of police services is something that actually happens in most parts of Europe only in the 1920s and 30s, and that is it's a very relevant discussion, but it's really something that takes place, I would say, in a very different context. Now there is a serious issue here, of course, about those soldiers and why they would want to participate in the more revolutionary networks. And it might very well be the case that these were people who were footloose, were looking for some kind of anchor in their lives, and that they found that in those societies, secret societies, revolutionary societies, that at least resonated with the kind of cause that they have been active in fighting. So yes, PTSD might have played a role, but I would say the effect of that would have been revolutionary action instead of police involvement. There is one serious problem here for the police at the time, and also for historical research in this topic. There was an intricate connection between those people, especially informants that went back and forth, were sometimes members of secret societies and then betraying people, but also sometimes more opportunistic and going back and forth between the two. So there was actually a lot of interaction, and many of the people that we found in the archives were actually people who had been in service of all kinds of different masters, different groups, some anti-revolutionary, some revolutionary, and it is very hard to find out at what point which side they take. And that was also, of course, a problem for the police services to actually find reliable informants for their work. Now, is this a precursor of Interpol? I would say it is, but not directly. The initiatives for Interpol did not actually build directly on this. But many of the techniques and also connections that people had established already from the beginning of the 19th century onwards were part of what in the end then came together in the formation of Interpol.
Beatrice, you wanted to come in on some of these issues of policing?
Yes, thank you very much. On the veterans and on the policing and on the bureaucrats. First of all, the one who was in charge of building the post-war police system in Europe was Fouché. And Fouché was Napoleon's minister, as you all know, and he was a Bonapartist. But Wellington said, we're going to keep Fouché. Metternich didn't want to, but he had to, because Wellington was the one in chief, the Prince of Waterloo. He was the commander of the Allied Army of Occupation. And what he did, Wellington, he founded the first European intelligence agency. It was called the Allied Security Service for Europe, which lasted 5 years. And it will come out in my new book, because I found it in the Berliner archives. And they posed Justus von Gruner at the head of this agency, and he was the Tsar spy master. He had worked for Hardenberg, and he came to Paris to charge this agency, and he had to learn from Fouché how he had to do it. So Fouché was made and forced, and Fouché was an opportunist, so he did so. It was made to teach the Europeans how to run an intelligence agency. And what Fouché was most keen on was not so much the militarization, but he was most keen on establishing the amount of fausses nouvelles in society, fake news. There was a whole directorate for fausses nouvelles. And why were the Bonapartists so keen on fausses nouvelles? And Metternich took this over. So the whole the thing that Metternich started in the German lands was based on this European Intelligence Agency. Fake news started the French Revolution. You may remember, the Grande Peur. So the Bonapartists knew that as soon as the public was going to suspect you, was going to arise, then the shit would hit the fan. So they had to know where the fake news would start. And this is what Fouché trained Gruner to do. This is what the Europeans did. And this is also when 1819 the Allied army went home, Metternich continued in the German lands. Because in France and in the Netherlands, other countries, they were fed up with this. And there was a gap between this European Intelligence Agency and the German aspirations. And then the Committee for Anarchism, you were asking for that. I put it in the list, but that only started in the 1860s, 1870s. After 1848 and then around the Paris Commune. So there was a gap between that, but they picked up where they left and again started with the fausses nouvelles. And as Ido so lucidly has shared, the epistemological intervention of sharing knowledge, establishing network, etc. But also very much, where did the fake news start? Where would it start? So where would they start to gather fake news in Europe? What do you think? Where would they dispatch their spies to? Throughout the 19th century.
Markets?
Cafes, cafe houses, especially places where women gathered and where they're drinking hot chocolate. Because the meaning rumors are spread by women over hot chocolate.
Graaf, do you want to come in? Hard to top that, but
yeah. Let's see. I guess just one thing I would note with Justus Gruner, he had been in the circle of kind of German nationalist secret societies during the Napoleonic Wars, part of the opposition to Napoleon, and had made himself rather suspect in a lot of the more conservative circles. So in a way, he's an example of ways in which a policy not unlike Napoleon's of trying to pick people from different parts of the political spectrum to serve the regime, was still being applied after 1815. So another one of the lessons maybe that were still being used there. Just briefly, a couple of points, one about the police and one about the growth of diplomatic bureaucracies and so on. With the veterans angle, my sense for German history is that it would depend on which part of Germany you're talking about, which state, and among other things, was it a state where the veterans had seen significant service in the Grande Armée and may have still been rather attached to Napoleon, even after 1815, or states where that had not been the case, so that this would look very different in Prussia or in Bavaria, for example, or even maybe in the Prussian Rhineland, which had for decades been under direct French rule. And the other thing with the police and militarization of the police, you do also have to look not so much at maybe the political police, but the gendarmerie, which was one of the main Napoleonic institutions that was widely imitated. So having a certain paramilitary wing of the police, especially for keeping order, maybe less in the cities, but in the countryside. And with Napoleon, it was very much the case that ex-soldiers filled a lot of the personnel in those units. And I think to some extent that would stay the case in other examples. And then similarly, even in Britain, which famously did not try to have a gendarmerie or paramilitarization, but that didn't make the Peelers, Peel's new police forces after 1829, 1830, any more popular. And so there were fears that they were pointing in that direction too, and a lot of the London Metropolitan Police were also drawing on ex-soldiers, especially non-commissioned officers. And then with the bureaucracy, I think that is largely true, that certainly by later standards, the size of the diplomatic service was not that large yet, though the numbers of places where you would have an ambassador, especially if you were one of the five great powers, was growing, and consulates opening up, in many, many places, many of which would still be manned by amateurs and kind of honorary types. But there was, even without exams, I think already, on the one hand, a wave of professionalization that you could already see to some extent by 1814, and that would expand a bit thereafter. Beatrice, I think, would agree with that, with some of the people that she's worked on, like Baron Gagern. And then also I would highlight the role of experts alongside activists. And of course, many activists, people from transnational civil society who were increasingly plugged into these discussions, thought of themselves as experts, self-appointed experts. But there were also a lot of academics or diplomatic officials who had been in certain regions or had certain connections that made them more knowledgeable about certain issues or geographic regions than others. And as these various conferences and commissions and so on were established in the course of the 19th century, they were trying to draw on a certain amount of expertise. So alongside professionalization, I think that was already a notable trend, but it's not going to look the same as what you get in the 20th century.
Thank you. We're at the 7:30 mark, but I know there is a lot of questions still in the room. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bundle the last four that I see hands for here, and then give the panel a chance to respond, and just ask everyone to be succinct in their questions and perhaps also in their answers, because time is ticking away. So I'm going to start here with Anasar, and then over here and over there. Yeah.
Right. So thank you for the extremely interesting discussion. I wanted to ask about the question of the essential conservatism that Adam raised, but in a specific direction. The national question, someone mentioned that, I think it was Professor Graaf, was essentially forbidden from discussions, but at some point, in a sense, there's a commitment to contain national questions in the beginning, and that changes. When does that change? What's the dichotomy pattern there? And yeah.
Thank you. That's great. So then, friend here. Yes.
I understand the links between the security services of the various European powers, as probably dominated by aristocrats. What are the links between the revolutionary groups? Was it ideology, nationalism? What creates the cohesion of these revolutionary groups that the security services are so frightened of?
That's a really important question to clarify. Gentleman here.
Yes, we heard previously in the first, second, third rank European states. Would the panelists please comment using the topic on the reestablishment of the state of Greece following the revolution of 1821 for the Ottomans? How would that fit in?
Excellent. I wanted to ask about that too. Does the exclusion of the Ottomans from the hierarchy mean that Greece is fair game? Is that a logical inference? And then gentleman at the back.
So my question related to something that was touched on, I think, by a couple of the panelists, the relationship between the post-1815 security culture that seems to be the focus in the policing dimension, etc., with the emergence of focus on economic security toward the end of the 19th century and obviously carrying over into the 20th as a foundation, for example, of the welfare state. Are we really talking about an extension of the same phenomenon? There's all sorts of modes that you can identify in terms of surveillance, data gathering, statistics, etc., that would draw a linkage there. Or are we talking about something that's a reaction against or to the excesses, if you will, of the security culture that I think Adam was alluding to, that there was some kind of opening up and a responsiveness of the state to different kinds of functional demands, social demands in particular.
Thank you. Great range of questions. So the economic, social question, the Greeks question, the revolutionary politics question, and the nationalism question. What could we ask for? Final round of responses to bring us home. Beatrice, do you want to start this time?
Yeah, thank you. As to the national question, thank you very much for bringing this up, because I think I have to disappoint you. This is one of those very persistent myths, that there was a national question that was stifled in 1850. There was no national question, not at all. There were some bands and liberals, and especially in Prussia, the fatherland groups, they were there. But they were inserted in the new regimes. And only in 1818, 1819, the government was a bit afraid of them and turned, and especially Metternich, they started to turn them down. So these first years, the first period was open and there was no national question. If there was a national question, it was very much a monarchistical national question. The peoples of Europe, they didn't want to have an emperor, they wanted to have monarchs, sovereigns that knew their people, and that would open their doors on Tuesday afternoon, as they did in all the capitals, for the people to come up and give their petitions. So it was a kind of a fatherly constitutionalist monarchy that arose, and only when this police culture started to grow more repressive, the identity politics erupted in the Balkans, in Greece, and elsewhere. So it was only a later day phenomenon, and it didn't start in 1815. That brings me to Greece. The Ottoman question was indeed kept out of the Vienna Congress, but after the Vienna Congress, Russia was reined in, and it was felt that Alexander I had given away too much, and that he had to be allowed, that he was reined in, and that he had not been allowed to get what he wanted. So Greece was very much a fruit of these ambassadorial conferences, with Britain keeping the reign on the Ionian Islands, and then there was a debate who was going to rule Greece, and Eric de Lange is going to write a book on how Polignac felt that the Dutch had to go over to Constantinople, rule the Ottoman Empire. Instead, the French would get the Netherlands in return, and then everything else would be solved in that region. In the end, the Netherlands didn't want to swap Amsterdam for Constantinople, and a Belgian king was offered Greece.
Yeah.
Neither did he want
that Bavarian, I think.
Yeah, Bavarian, sorry, and he got the Belgian crown later, and then in the end they ended up with another German. So that's and one last very short remark as to the revolutionary groups. What tied them together was that they were not aristocrats. Those were high professionalized new elites, the Bildungsbürgertum, who felt that it was now their turn to get a say. And many of those professional agents, those conspiratorial agents, they were people who didn't get a foot into the state bureaucracies, for example. And that's why they tried to conspire with each other. There's much more to it to say, and Ido will do that most certainly, but what tied them together was very much as today's terrorists. They were not explicitly poor. Neither were they explicitly lunatic or psycho, what do I know, pathological. They were just the ones with a little bit higher education, with a little bit more energy and zealotry, and they wanted to have their piece of the cake as well.
Brian, do you want to respond to any of these?
Let's see, I guess kind of going in order. With the national question, I would probably take a slightly middle position on that. I think there was a national question, or at least people thought there was at that time, which did provoke some fear, did provoke some hopes. It's much talked about, but as historians, I think we tend to emphasize now that it was very much a minority phenomenon. And so to some extent, the moderates and or conservatives were able to think that they were delivering partly what the broader population might want within these kind of paternalistic monarchies. And also that talking about nationhood and national identity was not forbidden. It was actually rather encouraged in a lot of these places. But precisely because they thought within the framework of a paternalistic monarchy or a multinational empire that you could let these groups cultivate their literature, folklore, identities, and so on without threat to the polity. It was only when it became, kind of secessionist nationalism that it was perceived as a strong threat. And that was very much a minority phenomenon in this period. It was really much later in the 19th century where that was more important. Along these lines, just a couple of thoughts about the cohesion of revolutionary groups. One of which has to do with nationalism, that you have quite a number of the various nationalist groups who are kind of cosmopolitan nationalists. They're not necessarily chauvinist nationalists, and so they dream of cooperating with one another. It's the basis of what would become the springtime of the peoples or of the nations in 1848, which famously falls apart when you're actually starting to draw borders and decide maybe who can work with whom. But at least for most of the period, it allows the basis for a lot of cooperation with things like Young Europe, made up of Young Poland, Young Italy, and so on, so Mazzinian groups. And then the other thing that helps them cohere is the fact that so many of them are in exile. So it's a repressive police society, but there are also limits to that. And they can usually find safe haven, in Switzerland or Brussels or Paris or London or somewhere. Later Krakow to some extent. And there they would hang out together and cooperate with one another, and maybe sometimes even concert conspiracies together, even if not quite to the extent that the police were fearing. With Greece, here, I would definitely emphasize that there is again a couple of rounds of ambassadorial conferences that help to negotiate this. Here, it's mostly British, Russian, and French ambassadors who are playing the strongest role, though Metternich and the Austrians clearly still have an important say and input. And the balance of power concept starts to play a role here again, too. Maybe precisely because there is a bit of a vacuum there with the ambiguous status of the Ottoman Empire. There is no way, for example, that the French are going to get their way and put the Dutch monarch in Constantinople and be allowed to take over Belgium by the British at that point. But also they establish a constitution, draw the borders for the new Greece, and establish a constitution for a monarchical regime in Greece. So again, kind of the moderation rather than fully reactionary status. And then, I don't know, were you going to say anything about economic security and welfare state? Or,
maybe.
Okay, then maybe I will defer to you on that one.
Do you want to bring us in?
Okay, so maybe two remarks. First of all, the aristocracy, which is a horribly complicated topic, especially in the 19th century. But one thing to establish here is that the personnel of the police services, and you might maybe even argue of states in general in the 19th century, were not there because they were aristocratic, but because they had certain skills. And I think that's a very fundamental shift in the way in which states operate. They require people with skills. So even if there were aristocrats, and many obviously were, they were there and had their position because they developed certain skills. And I think that is a very important thing to keep in mind, also to see the continuities of people working in the revolutionary, in the Napoleonic time, and then continue to work in the Restoration state. They did that not because they were opportunists, or they were not able to because they were opportunists, but spoke against them, but they had skills which made them necessary. They were needed because they could do certain things that other people could not. So that is, I think, very important to keep in mind. Yes, there, of course, the aristocracy had an important position, but not as aristocrats, but because they were able to do certain things. The other question then, the links between these revolutionary groups. I think one of the things that we try to convey here is, yes, there might have been all kinds of links, and especially, of course, that these were exile communities is, I think, a very important element to understand what bounded these people together. At the same time, my point would be, it doesn't really matter, because the fundamental point is the way in which the state, police services started to think about such groups, and that is where the innovation was. You had already from the 18th century into the 20th century and 21st century, you have groups of people who want to change society. That is not really new or innovative. The really innovative way, for aspect here, is the way in which states start to respond to that in the development of the instruments. Now that has to do maybe also with the final point of economic security and the welfare state. It's not a thing that is developed so much in the book, but I would say it is not a coincidence that the moment state starts to develop their informational basis, they start to develop knowledge about societies, that they also start to develop statistical material that will help them to get a grip on what is going on. And I think one of the important things here is that Brussels is not just a center where you have all those revolutionaries as well as police services that try to get a grip on it. You have also Michelet, and you have also Quetelet, and the first development in statistics as a science that is developed in this period, enabling to get a grip on the understanding of how societies function and what that has to do with social inequality and economic development.
Thank you very much for a really fascinating discussion.